I remember Greenfield, Indiana, through a filter of warm, golden light. It wasn't just a place, it was the bedrock of my life. For 52 years, Ilara Holloway had lived in this town, nurtured its community garden, volunteered at the local library, and cherished the quiet hum of our neighborhood. My home, a modest two-story nestled between mature oaks, was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a sanctuary, a testament to decades of hard work and peaceful living. My driveway, a single car width bordered by sturdy retaining walls, led straight to my garage, a practical private space. It was mine. I considered myself an observant woman, someone who noticed the subtle shifts, the tiny cracks in the veneer of civility. Over the past few years, those cracks had widened. New money had moved in, bringing with it a subtle, then not so subtle sense of entitlement. Small transgressions began to pile up. Trash cans left out for days, loud parties stretching into the early morning hours, children's toys cluttering sidewalks. Each instance, a tiny prick to the fabric of our community norms. I'd voiced concerns at neighborhood association meetings, written polite notes, even offered a helping hand, but the underlying disregard for shared space, for simple neighborly respect, only seemed to escalate. My motivation, I realized, was not just about my property, but about reclaiming the dignity of our collective home. I was tired, profoundly tired, of the escalating disregard for neighborhood norms and property rights. This wasn't just a nuisance. It was a symptom, and the driveway incident was about to become the blatant symbol of a problem that needed to be systematically dismantled. That Friday evening, a stifling late August evening, the air thick with humidity and the distant drone of cicadas, I drove my worn but reliable sedan down Maple Road. A sense of unease settled over me. As I approached my street, the usual quiet was shattered by a cacophony of sound. Loud music pulsed through the air, vibrating the windows of neighboring homes. Cars, a chaotic sprawl of them, lined both sides of the street, overflowing from the driveway of the opulent, recently renovated house 2 doors down. The new owners, the Millers, were notorious for their sprawling, boisterous gatherings. I gritted my teeth, gripping the steering wheel, then I saw it. A gleaming, oversized sport utility vehicle, a monstrous black beast, sat squarely in my driveway. Not partially, not mistakenly, but deep within, almost touching the retaining wall on the left. My breath caught in my throat. My driveway, my driveway. The sheer audacity of it left me momentarily speechless, a cold knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a deliberate act of disrespect, a brazen assertion of ownership over my private space. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of the entitlement I had been observing, growing like a noxious weed in our once pristine gardens. This wasn't just a car, it was the car, the culmination of every small, ignored slight. I felt a tremor of something new, something sharp and cold, begin to awaken within me. How could someone be so oblivious, so self-absorbed, to simply appropriate another person's property? The questions swirled, unbidden and unanswered. What kind of person did this? And what would it take for them to understand the lines they had crossed? I knew in that moment that this was not just a battle over a parking space. It was a confrontation, long overdue, about the very soul of our community. I pulled my car slowly to the curb, heart pounding, already formulating my first quiet steps. This was just the beginning. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. My mind raced, assessing the situation. The street was packed, no alternative parking nearby. My driveway, as I'd known for decades, was a peculiar design. It was a single car width, precisely, with a retaining wall on each side, built decades ago to mitigate a slight slope in the yard. At the end, my garage. It was a perfect trap, unintentionally, for any vehicle brazen enough to park there. A tow truck, I instantly realized, would be impossible. They'd need to get the truck in, position it, winch the vehicle out. Not with those walls, not without significant property damage, potentially to my walls or worse, their own vehicle. A slow, creeping smile touched my lips. A quiet, dangerous thought began to form. I carefully, deliberately maneuvered my car. I pulled past the offending SUV, then backed up slowly, inch by painful inch, until my front bumper kissed its rear. My tires nudged the passenger side wall, perfectly aligned. I was in my driveway, legally parked behind the invader. Trapped. I cut the engine, the sudden silence inside my car a stark contrast to the thumping bass from the Miller's party. A small wave of satisfaction, cool and clean, washed over me. This was my opening move, a quiet assertion of boundaries. I knew it wouldn't be the end, not with people like the Millers and their guests, but it was a firm first step. I wondered how long it would take them to notice, to realize the trap they had so carelessly walked into. The waiting began. I walked into my quiet home, the faint throb of the party music a distant hum. My cat, Mittens, rubbed against my legs, purring her greeting. I poured myself a glass of iced tea, then, with a mischievous glint in my eye, decided to celebrate. I pulled a chilled beer from the refrigerator. Not one of my usual habits, but this felt like an occasion. I settled onto my porch swing, watching the party 2 houses down. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, but my gaze remained fixed on my driveway, a silent sentry. Hours later, long after the twilight deepened into a velvety black, the first tentative knock came. Then a second louder, more insistent. I rose slowly, deliberately, taking another leisurely sip of my beer. I opened the door a crack. A young woman, likely in her late 20s, stood on my porch. Her designer dress was a bit rumpled, her makeup a little smudged, and her eyes held a mix of irritation and mild alarm. "Excuse me," she began, her voice edged with impatience. "My car is blocked in. Could you please move your vehicle?" I met her gaze, my expression calm, almost serene. "Oh," I said, a slight pause, "you're the one who parked in my driveway." My voice was even, devoid of accusation, simply stating a fact. But the implication hung heavy in the humid air. Her cheeks flushed. "Yes, well," she stammered, "it was an emergency, the street was full." An emergency? Parking in someone else's private driveway without permission was an emergency. My eyebrow quirked almost imperceptibly. "Look, I need to leave, I have an early flight tomorrow." I took another slow sip of my beer, letting the cool liquid slide down my throat. "I understand," I said, my voice sympathetic yet firm. "However, I've been home for several hours now, I've unwound. And as you can see," I gestured to the beer in my hand, "I've been enjoying a few adult beverages. I'm afraid I'm in no condition to drive right now." Her jaw dropped, a flicker of disbelief, then dawning fury crossing her face. "You're kidding me, right?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You're just going to leave my car there?" "It's not my car there," I corrected gently. "It's your car, parked illegally in my private driveway. And as I said, I've been drinking." "I certainly wouldn't risk a drunk driving charge, not for a mistake that isn't mine." I offered her a small, tight smile. "Perhaps you should have thought about where you were parking earlier." She scoffed, running a hand through her hair. "This is ridiculous, I'm calling the police." "You're welcome to," I said, feeling a surge of defiant satisfaction. "I'm legally parked on my own property. I've also been drinking. I'm confident they'll understand." I closed the door quietly, leaving her fuming on my porch. I walked back to my porch swing, picked up my book, and settled in to wait. A new question formed. How would the authorities react to such blatant entitlement? It wasn't long before the sharp rap on my door sounded again. This time, it was a more official knock. I made sure to grab a fresh, unopened beer from the fridge, the condensation cool against my fingers, before I answered. 2 police officers stood on my porch, their uniforms crisp despite the late hour. Officer Miller, a younger man I recognized from community events, looked a little uncomfortable. His partner, an older, stoic woman, Officer Davies, simply observed me. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about a blocked vehicle," Officer Miller began, his tone polite but firm. I nodded, holding up my beer. "Yes, officer, that would be the vehicle parked in my driveway without my permission. I just got home from a long week at work, unwound, and have been enjoying some adult beverages. As you can see, I'm certainly in no shape to operate a motor vehicle." I made sure my words were clear, my demeanor calm and cooperative but unwavering. Officer Miller glanced at the beer, then at my driveway, where the black SUV was clearly visible, trapped behind my smaller car. He exchanged a look with Officer Davies. Officer Davies stepped forward, her eyes assessing me. "Ma'am, do you understand that the individual needs to leave?" "I do, officer," I replied, maintaining eye contact. "And I sympathize with her predicament. However, her decision to park on private property without permission led to this. My decision to come home and relax with a drink, legally parked in my own driveway, is not the issue. The law is quite clear on impaired driving. I would never put myself or others at risk." I paused, letting my words sink in. "And as you can see, officer, my driveway is quite narrow. A tow truck would have an incredibly difficult, if not impossible, time removing her vehicle without causing property damage. Not to my car, mind you, but perhaps to hers or even my retaining walls. I wouldn't want to be held liable for that." Officer Miller sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She says you told her you were going on a weekend-long bender." A small, genuine chuckle escaped me. "Oh, did I? Well, officer, it has been a very long week. And it is a long weekend, isn't it?" Perhaps I did mention that I plan to thoroughly enjoy my time off. My car will be right there, perfectly legal until I go to work on Tuesday morning. I smiled pleasantly. I'm sure she can find alternative arrangements for her flight, perhaps an Uber or a taxi. The officers exchanged another look, this one heavier. They understood. They couldn't force me to drive impaired. They couldn't tow the car without a high risk of damage and liability. I was legally parked. Their hands were tied. It was a stalemate, and I had effectively used the system against the entitled. Officer Davies gave a curt nod. Understood, ma'am. We'll speak with the party concerned. They turned and walked back to the street. I watched them confer with the young woman, who was now joined by a harried-looking man, presumably her partner or husband. Their gestures grew increasingly agitated, but the officers remained firm. After a few minutes, the couple threw their hands up in exasperation, turned, and disappeared back into the party house. A profound sense of vindication settled over me. This was the first payoff, a small victory but deeply satisfying. The entitled Parker was stuck, but I knew this was only the beginning of the real struggle. People like them didn't just accept defeat. This single act of defiance, I suspected, would ripple outwards. I knew I had ignited a fire, and the smoke would soon drift beyond just my driveway. The question now was, what form would their retaliation take, and how would I, Alara Holloway, the community catalyst, respond to protect not just my property but the soul of Greenfield itself? This was no longer just about a car. It was about the systematic dismantling of a pervasive entitlement. The next morning, Saturday, the sun rose, hot and bright, casting long shadows across my lawn. The black SUV remained, a monument to arrogance. The party house was silent, presumably the revelers recovering from their Friday night excesses. I spent the morning watering my garden, humming softly, a peaceful front disguising the strategic gears turning in my mind. I observed. My observant nature, a trait cultivated over decades, was now on high alert. Around midday, a new figure emerged from the miller's house. A man, probably in his early 40s with a perpetually annoyed expression, stormed over to my front door. He didn't knock, he pounded. I opened the door, a polite smile on my face. "Are you the woman who blocked my sister's car?" he demanded, his voice thick with unbridled indignation. "She missed her flight. Do you have any idea the cost of changing a transatlantic flight?" "Good morning," I said calmly. "I am Alara Holloway. And your sister chose to park her vehicle in my private driveway without my permission. My car is legally parked on my own property. I'm afraid her travel arrangements are not my responsibility." He practically sputtered. "This is insane. You're holding her car hostage." "No," I corrected, my voice still mild. "She stranded her own car by parking where she shouldn't have. I merely returned to my home and legally parked my own vehicle. The police confirmed as much last night." His face contorted in a sneer. "You're a crazy old busybody, aren't you, interfering in everyone's business? This neighborhood was fine until people like you started making trouble." My smile tightened. "This neighborhood, sir, was fine until people like your sister started treating private property as their own personal parking lot. And people like you defend it. I believe in community norms in respect. Something your family seems to have forgot." The words were out before I could truly rein them in, a flicker of the community catalyst already stirring. This direct insult, this brazen dismissal of my character was a fresh wound. It was also, I realized, a promise. This man, and by extension, the Millers, would be a formidable and unpleasant opponent. I wondered just how far their entitlement stretched, and how deep their roots were in this pattern of disrespect. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. "You haven't heard the last of this, Alara Holloway, not by a long shot." He spun on his heel and stalked back to the Miller house. I closed my door, my heart pounding, not from fear but from a surge of righteous indignation. Crazy old busybody. The words stung. But they also clarified my resolve. This wasn't just about the car anymore. This was about a fundamental clash of values. This wasn't merely a minor incident. It was a symptom of a deeper rot, a disregard for the very principles upon which Greenfield was built. I spent the rest of Saturday not just observing but actively planning. My resourceful nature kicked in. I pulled out my laptop, something I rarely used for more than checking emails, and began to research. My first target: local ordinances, zoning laws, property rights, noise complaints. I cross-referenced the Millers' party habits with local statutes. How late could music be played? What were the rules on parking obstructions? What about property upkeep? I found a treasure trove of forgotten regulations, dusty bylaws that, if enforced, could make life very uncomfortable for those who disregarded them. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. This was how I would fight back. not with shouts and tantrums, but with facts, with rules, with the very foundation of civic order. I was gathering my ammunition, piece by careful piece. This was the initial progress beyond simply blocking the car. I was laying the groundwork for a systematic dismantling, not just of a car but of an entire attitude. Sunday passed in a similar vein. The SUV remained. The Millers remained conspicuously absent from my doorstep. I suspected they were strategizing, or perhaps stewing in their own self-importance. I, however, was productive. I started drafting a detailed, polite, but firm letter to the neighborhood association, outlining the pattern of disregard. I began documenting everything: dates, times, specific infractions. My observant trait became a potent weapon. I noted the overgrown bushes encroaching on the sidewalk from the Miller's property, the trash bags left at the curb days after collection, the constant stream of unknown vehicles blocking access for others. Each observation was a data point, contributing to a growing case file. By Monday morning, the long weekend drew to a close. I felt a pang of disappointment. The Parkers' family still hadn't managed to get her car out, and the immediate satisfaction of that was waning. I still hadn't seen the Parker herself. Presumably she'd found another way to her flight. The quiet victory was becoming tedious. What would Tuesday bring? Would the car still be there when I left for work? Would I be forced to move it just to get out of my own driveway? This question gnawed at me. And then, a new thought, a more devious one, surfaced. I hadn't said I was going on a bender at home. I just said I'd be on one. Perhaps a quiet trip out of town, a little detour, would serve to heighten the suspense and leave them stewing just a little longer. This thought, aligning perfectly with my resourceful nature, brought a mischievous glint to my eye. I had a few days off from work this week, a pre-planned vacation that I hadn't canceled. This was perfect. Tuesday morning I woke before dawn. The black SUV still sat in my driveway, a silent, arrogant monolith. I backed my car out, maneuvered it around the behemoth, and left my driveway clear. Not because I was giving in, but because the first phase of my plan was complete. The Parker had been inconvenienced. The police had confirmed my position. The Miller family had been put on notice. Now the real work began. The systematic dismantling. I wouldn't be going to work this Tuesday. I wouldn't be visible in Greenfield for a few days. My absence, I hoped, would sow a different kind of uncertainty for my entitled neighbors. It would make them wonder, it would make them wait. And waiting, when you're accustomed to immediate gratification, can be a potent form of torture. I packed a small bag, locked my door, and headed out of town for a few days, leaving the SUV to its fate and the Millers to theirs. My short trip was not a true bender but a period of intense focus. I didn't drink, I plotted. My observant nature had gathered the data. My resourceful mind was now assembling the strategy. I had seen the systemic disregard for neighborhood norms. I had experienced the personal affront. Now I would become the community catalyst, not just for myself, but for every quiet neighbor who felt their peace eroded by the entitled. My emotional state was transitioning from righteous indignation to a cold, burning determination. This wasn't rage, it was resolve. And with resolve came a new kind of calm, a chilling focus. When I returned to Greenfield 3 days later, on Friday, the black SUV was gone. A small, circular oil stain marred my pristine concrete driveway, a faint scar of its unwelcome visit. I walked up to the Miller's house. Their usual chaotic charm was gone. The yard looked unkempt, a few party decorations still fluttering forlornly. A sense of desolation hung in the air. I knocked on the door. It was opened by Mrs. Miller, a woman who usually exuded an air of manicured perfection. Now her eyes were bloodshot, her hair disheveled. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of its usual effervescence. "Just checking in," I said, my voice calm. "I see your guest's vehicle is gone. Everything all right?" Her eyes narrowed. "No, Alara, everything is not all right. My sister had to take a $2,000 flight change. She blamed us. Her husband blamed us. Our entire weekend was ruined because you decided to play games." "Games?" I asked, a slight lift of my eyebrow. "I simply parked my car in my own driveway. I merely exercised my legal right to not drive while impaired. Your sister's choices had consequences, as do yours apparently. This is our neighborhood too," she hissed. "We have rights. Rights come with responsibilities," I countered softly. "To your property, to your neighbors, to the shared peace of this community, something I've noticed has been lacking around here lately." Her face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "Just observations," I said, my voice sweet as honey, yet laced with steel. "The noise, the parking, the general disregard for the peace of others. Things people tend to notice. Things that can be, shall we say, documented. She stared at me, a flicker of fear in her eyes. The old busybody, as her brother had called me, was no longer just an annoyance. I was a threat, a woman who saw too much, documented too much. I smiled, a cool, polite smile. Have a good day, Mrs. Miller. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in her doorway, a new seed of dread planted firmly in her mind. This was a new progression. They weren't just annoyed, they were rattled. The following weeks were a slow, simmering escalation. The Millers, emboldened by their initial belief that I was just a one-off nuisance, began to subtly retaliate. Small acts of passive aggression, their lawnmower starting at 7 in the morning on a Saturday, just as I enjoyed my coffee on the porch. Loud conversations near my property line late at night. One morning, I found a discarded fast food wrapper in my front garden. Each incident, small on its own, was a deliberate poke, designed to test my resolve to make me regret my stance. But my core motivation was burning brighter now. This wasn't about me, it was about the cumulative disregard. The audience, I hoped, was feeling a sense of outrage, watching this escalating disrespect. How much more would Alara take? This was the promise, the quiet before the storm. My response was not confrontational. My observant nature guided me, I became a sentinel. I installed a small, unobtrusive security camera on my porch, pointing towards my driveway and the edge of their property. I continued my meticulous documentation. Dates, times, specific details of every infraction. The noise levels. The exact spots where their guests' cars consistently blocked the sidewalk or obscured fire hydrants. The precise measurements of their overgrown shrubs spilling onto public right-of-way. My resourceful mind dug deeper into municipal codes, into the almost forgotten bylaws of Greenfield. I discovered regulations regarding property maintenance, noise pollution, public nuisance. I became an amateur expert on local bureaucracy. I also began to quietly reach out to other long-term residents. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet elderly woman whose garden had been trampled by partygoers' cars. Mr. Peterson, a retired schoolteacher, fed up with late-night bass disturbing his sleep. They too had felt the shift, the erosion of their peace, but felt powerless or simply too polite to act. I didn't preach. I didn't accuse. I simply listened, then shared my own observations, my own meticulous notes. Did you know, I'd ask casually, that the city ordinance states trees and shrubs cannot extend more than 2 feet over the public sidewalk? Or, I found this interesting clause about noise levels after 11 o'clock. It applies to private property too. My community-driven trait was taking hold. I was weaving a subtle web, linking individual grievances into a collective understanding. This was the slow, steady progression of my role as the community catalyst, drawing others into the fight, empowering them with knowledge. Then came the rock bottom, the moment that truly cemented my transformation from a concerned citizen to an unwavering force for change. It happened on a brisk autumn evening. I had organized a small, informal gathering of concerned neighbors at the community center, a quiet discussion about preserving neighborhood character. We talked about traffic, noise, property values. I didn't name names, but the underlying subject was clear. The Millers. The very next day, I woke to find my front lawn had been vandalized. Not severely, but symbolically. Someone had spray-painted busybody in crude, ugly letters across my meticulously maintained grass. A large section of my prize-winning hydrangeas, blooming vibrantly just the day before, had been trampled and snapped. It was a message, loud and clear. A threat. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. My breath hitched. This was no longer just about inconvenience or noise. This was a direct, personal attack on my home, on my efforts, on my peace. This was an escalation from petty annoyances to outright aggression. A consuming anger, cold and precise, settled in my chest. The pain in my stomach was palpable. My body felt heavy, weighted down by the injustice. It wasn't the material damage that hurt. It was the sheer contempt, the willingness to violate another's sanctuary. This pushed me past outrage, past despair, into a realm of absolute resolve. They wanted a fight. I would give them one, but it wouldn't be on their terms. It wouldn't be a childish back and forth. It would be systematic. It would be a dismantling. The silence of my grief quickly turned into the hum of a meticulously calibrated engine. This was the true payoff of despair, the catalyst for the final act. Now I would transform. I wouldn't just be Alara Holloway, resident of Greenfield. I would be the architect of their undoing. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. My transformation was not sudden, but a hardening, a sharpening of my purpose. The spray paint on my lawn, the trampled hydrangeas, they were not just acts of vandalism, they were a declaration of war. and I, Alara Holloway, would be the general. My despair had curdled into an unshakable resolve, fueled by my deep-seated motivation to restore the community's equilibrium. My key traits, observant, resourceful, community-driven, no longer just defined me, they became my weapons. I cleaned the spray paint myself, carefully, methodically, scrubbing away the crude letters. I tended to my broken hydrangeas, pruning the damaged stems, knowing they might recover or they might not. As I worked, my mind hummed with a cold, clear logic. This retaliation was foolish. It showed their hand. It proved their desperation. And it gave me the final piece of leverage I needed to become the full-fledged community catalyst. My first move was unexpected, for them at least. I didn't call the police immediately about the vandalism. Not yet. Instead, I called the Greenfield Neighborhood Association president, a man named Robert Jenkins, whom I'd known for years. I invited him over, along with a few of the other concerned neighbors I'd quietly cultivated. I didn't tell them about the vandalism until they arrived. When they saw my lawn, a collective gasp went through the small group. Their faces registered shock, then anger. Mrs. Henderson, her hands trembling, whispered, "Oh, Alara, who would do such a thing?" "I think we all know who," Mr. Peterson said, his voice grim. "This is clearly from the Millers. They thought they could silence you." "Precisely," I said, my voice calm, belying the storm inside me. "And they are wrong. They have mistaken my patience for weakness and my desire for peace for an unwillingness to fight. This isn't just about my lawn anymore. This is about intimidation. This is about them believing they are above the rules, above decency, above the very community they live in." I looked at each of them, meeting their eyes. "This is about all of us, and we are going to stop it, systematically." My plan began to unfold, meticulous as clockwork. My observant nature had gathered evidence. My resourceful mind had devised the strategy. My community-driven spirit was now rallying the troops. Phase 1, the data flood. I didn't just have my notes, I now had camera footage. The vandal hadn't been caught on camera, as they had approached from the other side of my house, but the camera had captured various other infringements by Miller guests: cars blocking fire hydrants, loud conversations. More importantly, it provided a sense of security and a threat of surveillance. I instructed my network of neighbors to do the same. Not to confront, but to observe, to document, to record. Noise, parking violations, overgrown hedges, uncollected trash, anything that violated a city ordinance or a clear neighborhood standard. We created a shared, anonymous online document, a repository of grievances, time-stamped and photographed. It was a quiet rebellion, fueled by data. I then crafted a series of official letters. The first went to the Greenfield Public Works Department, detailing the overgrown hedges and trees from the Miller property that impeded pedestrian traffic on the sidewalk, citing specific municipal codes. The second went to the Greenfield Police Department, not about the vandalism, but about the chronic parking violations on the street during Miller parties, complete with dates, times, and photographic evidence. The third went to the Environmental Services Department regarding uncollected trash and potential rodent issues due to prolonged streetside refuse. Each letter was polite, professional, and thoroughly documented, reflecting my meticulous nature. I did not mention the Millers by name in these initial letters. I simply reported infractions at specific addresses. It was about principle, not just personal vendetta. Phase 2, the public pressure. Next, I leveraged my role as a community catalyst. I didn't organize protests or confrontations. Instead, I organized a series of neighborhood beautification days. We focused on cleaning up public spaces, planting flowers, and subtly addressing the areas where the Millers' disregard was most evident. We pruned public trees near their property. We picked up litter that had blown onto the street from their parties. This wasn't just about cleaning, it was about drawing attention. It was about creating a stark contrast: our quiet, cooperative efforts versus their chaotic indifference. I also initiated a Know Your Rights, Know Your Neighbors workshop at the community center. I, along with Mr. Peterson, who had a background in local government, led sessions explaining city ordinances, how to report violations, and the proper channels for dispute resolution. We provided printouts of relevant codes, step-by-step guides for filing complaints, and even templates for formal letters. We didn't say, "Go report the Millers." We empowered people with knowledge. We gave them the tools. We encouraged them to hold everyone accountable, including themselves, to the standards of a respectful community. The turnout was surprisingly large, a testament to how many people felt powerless but yearned for order. This was the grand progression of my plan. building a collective consciousness. The Millers, meanwhile, were oblivious or perhaps just arrogant. They saw our efforts as quirky neighborhood activities, unaware that each pruned hedge, each documented noise complaint, each shared piece of information was a brick in the wall closing around them. Their parties continued, albeit with slightly less street parking, as city officials, prompted by our anonymous, data-driven complaints, began placing no parking signs in specific problem areas. A small victory, but a clear sign that the bureaucratic machinery was slowly grinding into motion. Then came the first sting. The Greenfield Public Works Department sent the Millers an official notice, citing their overgrown hedges and demanding they be trimmed back to comply with the 2-foot sidewalk clearance ordinance within 30 days or face fines. I heard about it from Mrs. Henderson, who had seen the official envelope in their mailbox. Mrs. Miller was apparently furious, complaining loudly about meddling neighbors. I allowed myself a small, internal smile. This was a mini payoff, a confirmation that my systematic approach was yielding results. But the game was far from over. I wondered how they would react. Would they comply, or would their entitlement lead them to defy official orders? Their reaction was predictable. They ignored the notice. Their hedges remained untrimmed. This defiance was a critical mistake, a testament to their unwavering belief in their own impunity. It also allowed my strategy to advance to its next, more impactful phase. Phase 3, the escalation of consequences. After the 30-day period elapsed, I and several other neighbors filed formal, official complaints with the Public Works Department, referencing the initial notice sent to the Miller's address and attaching updated photographic evidence. We cited not only the physical obstruction, but also the increased safety risk for pedestrians, especially children, forced into the street. It was undeniable. Soon after, a municipal vehicle, a small white pickup truck with the city logo, pulled up to the Miller's house. 2 city workers, accompanied by a police officer, began trimming the hedges themselves. The noise of the electric trimmers filled the usually quiet street. Mrs. Miller emerged, face beet red, yelling at the workers, threatening lawsuits. The police officer calmly explained that they were acting within their legal right, as a violation notice had been issued and ignored. The Millers were then presented with a bill for the city's services, plus a hefty fine for noncompliance. The collective satisfaction among my quiet network of neighbors was palpable. It was a public humiliation, a clear message that their defiance would not be tolerated. This was a stronger payoff, moving us closer to the overall sense of vindication for the community. The Millers were beginning to understand the consequences of their actions, but I knew this was just the tip of the iceberg. What would they do now? Would they finally give in or double down on their belligerence? Their response was once again to double down. Their anger, now directed at the perceived anonymous forces working against them, manifested in new ways. They started parking their own cars deliberately in a way that blocked the view from their driveway, forcing cars to swing wide to avoid collision, creating a hazard. They began hosting smaller but more frequent loud gatherings during weekday evenings, clearly testing the noise ordinance boundaries. I knew this meant they were feeling the pressure, but they were lashing out. My resolve hardened. They were not merely entitled, they were defiant. And defiance required a stronger response. My network continued its work. The camera on my porch, and now several others strategically placed by willing neighbors, captured every violation. My folders swelled with printouts. I felt the weight of the community's trust on my shoulders, but also the burning motivation that had been solidified by the vandalism of my lawn. This was no longer just about justice. It was about showing that the systematic dismantling was possible. Phase 4. The legal net. This was the most complex and resource-intensive phase, leveraging my resourceful nature to its fullest. I knew that repeated, documented violations, particularly those impacting safety or quality of life, could lead to more significant legal action. I consulted, discreetly, with a retired lawyer I knew from my library volunteer days. He advised me on how to present the evidence in a way that would compel the city prosecutor's office to act. We submitted a comprehensive dossier to the city detailing all infractions, the continued parking issues, the noise complaints, the nuisance issues, even the neglected property maintenance that fell outside the scope of the hedge trimming. We included the police reports from the initial driveway incident, highlighting the family's aggressive demeanor. I made sure to emphasize the pattern, the systematic nature of their disregard. The key, I explained to my fellow catalysts, was to show not isolated incidents, but a chronic problem impacting multiple residents. We made it clear this wasn't one disgruntled neighbor, it was a collective cry for order. The city, accustomed to dealing with individual complaints, was overwhelmed by the sheer volume and meticulous detail of our consolidated evidence. This was the beauty of the community-driven approach. It multiplied our impact exponentially. The prosecutor's office, facing an undeniable mountain of evidence, had no choice but to take action. The first tangible result of this phase was a formal cease and desist letter, delivered to the Millers by a city attorney. It outlined the numerous violations, stated the potential penalties for continued noncompliance, escalating fines, property liens, and even, in extreme cases, forced sale of the property for persistent public nuisance. This was a major payoff for me and for the network. It was the system, finally, turning its full attention on the problem. The Millers were now officially in the city's crosshairs. Their outrage, I heard through the grapevine, was immense. Mrs. Miller was seen screaming into her phone on her front porch, clearly distraught. This was the kind of progress I had envisioned, slow but relentless, crushing them with the weight of bureaucracy and their own arrogance. How would they react to this legal pressure? Would they buckle or fight? My instincts told me they would fight, adding another layer of complex engagement to the story. They fought. Oh, how they fought. True to their entitled nature, the Millers hired an aggressive, expensive lawyer from downtown. The lawyer, a man named Sterling Vance, sent me and several other key members of my network thinly veiled threats of defamation lawsuits, harassment charges, and anything else he could conjure. He claimed we were orchestrating a malicious campaign, driven by jealousy and a vendetta against their successful and vibrant family. This was the moment of peak tension, the rock bottom for the entire community. It was designed to sow fear, to fracture our unity. I received a registered letter from Sterling Vance, a thick envelope filled with legalese. It accused me of leading a witch hunt, of slandering their good name, and demanded that I cease all harassing activities immediately or face legal consequences. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read it. This was different from a spray-painted lawn. This was a direct, personal legal threat, and it was designed to intimidate. It was a tangible loss, a blow to my peace of mind. The financial implications alone, if I had to hire a lawyer to defend myself against such a baseless but aggressive suit, were terrifying. My stomach churned. The very real risk of losing everything I had worked for, simply for standing up for what was right, weighed heavily on me. This was the true despair, the moment of helplessness. This was exactly the kind of consuming anger and hopelessness I wanted my audience to feel for Alara. Would she fold under the pressure? Would all her efforts be for naught? My initial reaction was a cold dread. I was not a lawyer. I was a simple woman who loved her quiet neighborhood. Could I truly stand up to this? Doubt, like a venomous snake, began to coil around my resolve. I called Mr. Peterson, my retired lawyer confidant. His voice, usually so steady, had a tremor of concern. Alara, this is serious. They're trying to bleed you dry. Intimidation by litigation. It's a classic tactic. But as I hung up, a strange calm settled over me. This was it. This was their final, desperate gambit, and it showed me their true fear. They weren't fighting the city, they were fighting us. They were fighting the collective power of a community that had simply said enough. My observant nature had noted their patterns of defiance. My resourceful mind had researched the legal landscape, and my community-driven spirit refused to back down. This was their rock bottom, their final, desperate push. It was time for my ultimate transformation. The next morning, I called a special, urgent meeting of my core group of neighborhood catalysts. My voice was steady, infused with a new, unwavering determination. I explained the legal threats. Some faces paled. Mrs. Henderson wrung her hands, but Mr. Peterson, his eyes meeting mine, gave a slow nod. Trying to scare us off, I stated, my voice calm and clear. They believe that money and threats can quash what is right, but they are mistaken. We have done nothing wrong. We have simply documented truth and followed established procedures. We are acting as responsible citizens. What do we do, Alara? A younger neighbor, Sarah, asked, her voice tinged with fear. We escalate, I replied, a chilling resolve in my tone. We use their own tactics against them. We hit them where it hurts most, their wallets, their reputations, and their perceived untouchability. This is no longer just about enforcing rules. This is about total vindication. This is about showing them that an entire community, united, is a force far more powerful than any legal threat or bank account. The emotional shift was complete. Despair had been transmuted into an unyielding will. This was the true promise of resolution. My resourcefulness kicked into overdrive. I spent days at the county courthouse poring over public records. My observant eye caught every detail. I traced the Millers' property deeds, their business registrations, any public filings. I started building a new kind of dossier, not just of nuisances, but of vulnerabilities. What I found was startling and confirmed the twist I had begun to suspect. The Millers' opulence, their lavish parties, their expensive cars, their aggressive lawyer, it was all built on a house of cards. Their primary source of income, I discovered, came from a series of highly leveraged investment properties, many of which had outstanding code violations, unregistered rentals, and even some questionable zoning applications in other towns, information buried deep in public records that few bothered to cross-reference. Their successful family business was teetering on the edge, vulnerable to any public scrutiny, any regulatory pressure. Their aggressive defense wasn't just about protecting their reputation in Greenfield, it was about protecting their fragile empire. This was the core of my systematic dismantling. My revenge would be multifaceted, hitting them on all fronts and leveraging their own greed against them. Phase 5. The financial squeeze and public unmasking. My strategy was precise. First, I helped my neighbors draft detailed, official responses to Sterling Vance's threats, stating that all actions taken were within legal bounds and were responses to verifiable nuisances. We included copies of our original complaints to the city demonstrating transparency. We also hinted, politely, but firmly, that any further intimidation would be met with an even more robust public response. Next, I shifted my focus to their Achilles heel, their other properties. I anonymously compiled all the code violations, unregistered rentals, and zoning issues I had unearthed in other jurisdictions. I then mailed these meticulously documented packets, not to the Millers' city lawyer, but to the relevant municipal departments and local news outlets in those other towns. I also created an anonymous but public social media account dedicated to Greenfield community standards, where I calmly, factually, and without naming names, posted about the general importance of property upkeep, following local ordinances, and the dangers of uninspected rental properties, linking to official government resources and news articles about similar issues in other places. This subtly drew attention to the type of issues the Millers faced elsewhere, without directly implicating them. My community-driven efforts were now expanding beyond Greenfield, creating a wider net of accountability. The ripple effect was immediate. Local code enforcement in other towns, spurred by anonymous tips and the sudden public interest, began to inspect the Millers' properties. Fines were issued. Unregistered rentals were discovered, leading to more penalties. Construction permits were scrutinized. Their various businesses, built on a foundation of cutting corners, began to face increased regulatory pressure. The media in those towns, smelling a story, started asking questions. The grand payoff began to materialize. The Millers' lawyer, Sterling Vance, suddenly found himself defending his clients not just in Greenfield against busybody neighbors, but against multiple municipal bodies and media inquiries across several jurisdictions. His attention and their money was being severely stretched. The threats against me evaporated, replaced by a desperate damage control operation. Meanwhile, back in Greenfield, the final, most satisfying part of the revenge was still unfolding. The city, still reeling from the sheer volume of our earlier evidence, and now bolstered by the news of the Millers' troubles elsewhere, initiated a formal public nuisance hearing against them. This was the ultimate victory. The entire city council, the public, the local press would hear the full scope of their disregard. This was the stage for public vindication. The hearing was standing room only. Elara Holloway, the quiet woman from Maple Road, sat in the front row, a stoic observer. Other neighbors, now empowered and emboldened, filled the seats behind me. The city attorney presented a damning case, citing every documented noise complaint, every parking violation, every instance of property neglect. They showed photographs, played audio recordings, and referenced official police reports. Then they brought up the vandalism of my lawn, officially linking it to the pattern of harassment. The Millers, pale and nervous, sat beside their now visibly harried lawyer. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium, my steps firm. I didn't yell or accuse. I spoke calmly, articulately, and with quiet power. I recounted the initial driveway incident, the rude demands, the police interaction. I spoke of the escalating disrespect, the systematic erosion of neighborhood peace. I showed photos of my vandalized lawn. I spoke not just for myself, but for Mrs. Henderson, for Mr. Peterson, for Sarah, for every family who had been too afraid, too busy, or too polite to speak up. I ended by saying, we, the residents of Greenfield, deserve to live in peace. We deserve respect. And we expect our city to uphold the standards that make this a wonderful place to call home. This isn't just about one family, it's about setting a precedent for every resident of this town. The audience was completely silent, then erupted in quiet, respectful applause. The city council's decision was swift and unanimous. The Millers were declared a public nuisance. They faced a litany of escalating fines, a mandatory injunction to comply with all ordinances within 60 days, and a warning that continued violations could lead to more severe penalties, including potential forfeiture of their property for public good if they persisted in their flagrant disregard for the law. Their reputation in Greenfield was in tatters, forever associated with entitlement and disregard. This was the grand payoff, the triumphant peak of the emotional journey. The audience, I hoped, was feeling the surge of triumph and vindication. The immediate consequences were profound. Within weeks, the Miller house went up for sale. Not quietly, but with a palpable desperation. They were bleeding money from their other ventures, facing fines and legal fees, and their once charming Greenfield home had become a symbol of their public disgrace. The parties stopped. The noise ceased. The street parking became orderly once more. True peace, for me, was not found in their suffering, but in the quiet restoration of my community. The hum of civility returned to Greenfield. Neighbors walked their dogs again, children played in front yards, and the soft murmur of polite conversation replaced the blare of disrespectful music. My hydrangeas, though bruised, began to sprout new leaves, a testament to resilience. The moral implications were clear. Standing up for what is right, even against overwhelming arrogance, can indeed shift the scales of justice. It wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about reclaiming dignity, restoring balance, and proving that a united community can dismantle even the most entrenched forms of entitlement. I learned that my own power, and the power of others, lay not in anger, but in methodical, persistent, community-driven action. My own journey had come full circle. I was no longer just Alara Holloway, a resident of Greenfield. I was the community catalyst, the quiet force that had reminded an entire town of its forgotten values. I still tended my garden, still volunteered at the library, but now I did so with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing I had helped cultivate a stronger, more respectful community. As for the surprising twist. Months later, long after the Millers had quietly sold their house and vanished from Greenfield, I received a small, unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a single, crisp $100 bill and a short typewritten note. It read, "Thank you for the lesson. It was expensive but invaluable. The entitled Parker." A small, unsettling shiver ran down my spine. She had been watching. She had learned. Or perhaps she had simply found a new, quieter form of entitlement. Either way, the message was clear. Some lessons, once learned, linger. The fight for community standards was never truly over. It was an ongoing vigilance. And I, Alara Holloway, was ready for whatever came next. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily.